Thank you so much, Manas, for this generous introduction. I hope my presentation is visible. My slides are visible. Okay, great. So I would also like to say that I am here representing the Inclusive AI Lab, which is co-founded by Professor Payal Arora, and she was my PhD supervisor at Erasmus. So currently, I'm an AI researcher at the Inclusive AI Lab, which is based out of the Netherlands. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. Today, I want to explore, as Manas has already told you about digital labor platforms, I want to explore how they are increasingly being governed by AI systems and why we must rethink their design through feminist and ethical frameworks. I'm sure when we hear the word feminist, a lot of things come to our mind. So I think today we'll be able to unpack how really this word, feminism really means in context to digital labor platforms and design. So, my central argument is that platforms are not neutral technological intermediaries, they are algorithmically managed workplaces. If AI systems are shaping wages, visibility, reputations, and risk, then design becomes a question of justice. And this is what I want to unpack with you today. So, before I formally begin, I would like you to think about this question that who designs the platforms that now design work? As you must have realized, increasingly, a lot of people in our informal economy are getting work through digital labor platforms. But who gets to design this work? Today, digital labor platforms do much more than connect workers and customers. They decide who gets tasked, how much they would earn, how they are ranked, and sometimes they remain on the platform at all. Whether they will remain on the platform at all or not? In many cases, these decisions are no longer made by visible human managers, but by algorithmic systems operating in the background. Since we all, I'm assuming, are working in white collar jobs, we do not realize the precarity of a situation where our human managers are being replaced by algorithms. However, this distant reality is actually this distant future is a reality for gig workers. If algorithms are effectively functioning as managers, then we must ask whose values are being encoded in these systems, what assumptions about productivity, flexibility, gender roles, risk, and fairness are built into their design. Because when platform design work, design itself becomes a site of power. And that is precisely why feminist design and ethical AI become crucial to this discussion. Before we move into critique, let me briefly clarify what we mean by digital labor platforms. I'm going to spend 2 slides just understanding what do we really mean by the term digital labor platforms. And you are in a social media FDP, why it is still important to understand digital labor platforms. So, digital labor platforms function as what Berg and colleagues called digital matchmakers. They connect workers with consumers of work, provide the technological infrastructure, and set the governance conditions under which work is exchanged. But they're not neutral intermediaries. They determine the terms of service, the rules of engagement, as I already mentioned, the mechanisms of payment, and the visibility of workers within the system. In other words, platforms are not just marketplaces, they are systems of governance. They structure how work is discovered, how it is even allocated, evaluated, assessed, compensated. And once we recognize platforms as governance structures rather than just mere apps, it becomes easier to see why their design has profound social and political implications and why we are actually discussing design of digital labor platforms. Now, this diagram, which I have taken from Smith 2017, the citation is not visible here. This diagram categorizes digital labor platforms into two primary types. On the left hand side, you would see web based platforms, also called cloud work, and location based platforms, often referred to as gig work. I will also extend this typology to include creator economy platforms or social media platforms, as you would understand, which function somewhat differently but are equally governed by algorithmic systems. Let me begin with web-based platforms shown on the left. These are forms of labor performed entirely online, as you would understand with the word cloud. Within this category, we see three key subtypes. First, freelance marketplaces. Of course, the typology can change depending on the author, but this is a generally acceptable categorization across platform labor scholarship. So these platforms connect individual clients with freelancers or specific tasks. Workers complete through profiles, ratings, and bidding systems. Reputation becomes currency, and algorithmic visibility determines opportunity. And that is also, by the way, very true with social media. Second, micro-tasking crowd work. Here, large tasks are broken into small, repetitive units and distributed across a dispersed workplace. Workers are often anonymous and interchangeable. Labor becomes highly fragmented and paid per task. Third one is contest based creative crowd work. In this model, multiple workers submit solutions or creative outputs, but only a few are compensated. Competition is built directly into the design of the platform, which shifts risk onto the workers. Now, on the right hand side, where I also did my PhD, we see location based platforms or gig work. These depend on geographic proximity, also depend on international regulation and other kinds of rule of land. They are also very relevant here. The first example is of accommodation platforms where individuals monetize property or spare space. While framed as sharing, this is also labor involving management, cleaning, communication, and compliance, as you must have read a lot of stories about Airbnb. Second is the transportation and delivery services. Here, algorithmic systems match drivers or delivery workers to customers in real time. Dynamic pricing, ratings, route optimization structure their working conditions. Third is the household and personal services, as you would properly understand with Uber, with Urban Clap. Workers provide cleaning, repairs, beauty services, or other forms of embodied labor. Again, task allocation, visibility, and evaluation are algorithmically mediated. Now, I want to extend this framework to include creator economy platforms, which are not fully captured in this diagram. These are platforms where visibility becomes labor. Content creators, influencers, streamers produce digital content, but their income depends on recommendation algorithms, monetization policies, and audience analytics. Unlike gig or micro task platforms, creator platforms do not assign discrete tasks. Instead, they govern attention. This is the most important part. Algorithms determine their reach, discoverability, revenue potential. I'm sorry, I think somebody has a question. Manas, would you want me to take the questions now or later?
Uh, yeah, you can take, ma'am.
Okay. Yes, somebody has a
Yeah,
question.
Prashant, please unmute yourself and please ask.
Okay, maybe they've raised it by mistake. I'll continue then. So, I was talking about creator economy platforms. So, these platforms govern on attention. Their algorithms determine reach, discoverability, and revenue potential. In this sense, they're attention allocation systems rather than task allocation systems. Now, across all these three categories cloud work, gig work, and attention work the unifying feature is algorithmic management. AI systems mediate opportunity, they structure competition, they distribute risk, and they also shape precarity. This typology helps us see that digital labor spans cognitive work, physical work, affective work, and creative work. And in all these cases, platform design choices have material and unequal consequences. Now, across all forms of digital labor platforms, whether cloud work, gig work, creator economy platforms, we see a common thread. This common thread is the algorithmic governance, or we can say governance structure built around algorithmic systems. Now, the first part here is algorithmic management. Platforms delegate managerial authority to AI systems. Instead of human supervisors, worker interacts with interfaces, dashboards, and automatic notifications. Now imagine you got late at work today, and your human manager probably would understand that okay, you have got late at work, and he might just adjust your attendance in our office, like they will reconcile it for us. But these workers do not have that option of interacting with human managers. They have to interact with the system, they have to raise complaints and argue with the system, convince the system. Now, the second part is rating systems. Workers are constantly evaluated by customers, clients, or engagement metrics. These ratings directly influence future opportunities, their income stability, and sometimes continued access to the platforms. I've spoken to so many taxi drivers who just say that without any reason or without them getting to know, their ratings just go down. They don't even understand that which customer have rated them down. So it's this constant pressure they live in that their ratings can just keep on declining. Third is the dynamic pricing. Compensation is often determined by real time calculation based on demand, supply, location, and even behavioral predictions. Workers typically do not know how these pricing systems are calibrated. And even if they try to learn, they're not literate enough, they're not educated enough to even understand that how task will be allocated, dynamic pricing will work. So they try to just guess, do a guesswork. Fourth is continuous data extraction. Now, every click, acceptance rate, GPS movement, their response time, their break time, engagement pattern becomes their data. Data is not incidental, it is central to how platforms generate value and exercise control. And it is so interesting that whenever I speak in my classes, in my normal classrooms, and I ask my students that, why is data important? Are you wary of your data being collected? And my students don't even, realize that what is the importance of this data. And I think digital labor platforms offer us that site where we actually understand that why data is important. So that is why we say that data is central to how platforms generate value and how they are exercising control. At the core of these features is algorithmic management, which I've already discussed. AI acting as managers, they are allocating tasks, they are doing scoring performances, doing behavioral monitoring, triggering automated penalties. In some cases, they also make deactivation decisions, effectively terminating workers without meaningful human review. This is not merely technological automation, it is restructuring of managerial authority. And this leads us to the myth of technological neutrality. Algorithms are often presented as objective, data driven, and unbiased. However, they encode institutional priorities. If a company prioritizes efficiency over worker well being, that priority shapes optimization models. They reflect economic incentives, especially in venture capital backed platforms where growth and profitability are paramount. They reproduce social biases embedded in historical data. If society is unequal, data will reflect that inequality. And finally, they reinforce power hierarchies. Platform owners design the system, workers must comply with it. Control over algorithmic design becomes control over labor conditions. So, when we talk about AI and digital labor platforms, we are not talking about neutral tools. We are talking about coded governance structures. Moving on, in the previous slide, I outlined the structural architecture of digital labor platforms, algorithm management, rating systems, and other things. Now I want to shift the focus from structure to consequence. Algorithmic governance does not operate in vacuum. These systems are deployed within societies that are already deeply unequal, especially in Indian context. When automated managerial control intersects with gender norms, caste hierarchies, class disparities, and informal labor markets, the result is not neutrality, it is amplified precarity. For example, dynamic pricing models may reward hyper availability, but women who have caregiving responsibilities or safety concerns cannot always remain constantly available. And you will also see in some of the examples I highlight later in my presentation where I've spoken to the workers and they have narrated what has happened. So, rating systems may appear objective, but they can reproduce customer biases related to gender, caste, accent, or appearance. Opaque right allocation systems may disadvantage those who cannot operate during high demand hours due to safety risk. In contexts like India and other global south economies, where informal labor is already dominant and social protection systems are weak, algorithmic governance can intensify vulnerability rather than reduce it. So, this is the moment where we must ask if platforms are embedding existing inequalities into automated systems, how should we redesign them differently? And this is precisely where feminist design and ethical AI frameworks become essential. So this slide will give you some overview about, what do I really mean by feminist design? Why do I keep talking about feminist conceptual lens? What do we really mean by these frameworks? So to move beyond critique and towards reconstruction, I draw on three contemporary feminist frameworks. First is Shawin Badzal's feminist HCI, which is human computer interaction framework. And she argues that feminism is a natural ally to interaction design. This is because feminism is fundamentally concerned with agency, empowerment, equity, and social justice, the very issues that are at stake in the design of digital platforms. Badzal challenges the idea that design is neutral and instead calls for pluralism, participation, embodiment, and ecological awareness. In other words, technologies must be designed with attention to lived experience, social context, and even power relations. Second is Costanza Chalk's design justice framework. She extends this argument by focusing explicitly on distribution of benefits and burdens in design. Design justice asks who benefits from technological systems and who pays the cost. It insists on meaningful participation of marginalized communities in decision making processes rather than treating workers as passive users. It calls for governance and collective involvement in shaping technological infrastructures. Third is the cross culture feminist approach, as articulated by scholars such as Payal Arora and Raman Chaudhary. They remind us that technology design cannot assume a universal user. Much of platform design is rooted in Western assumptions about mobility, infrastructure, safety, and autonomy. However, in global south contexts where informal economies dominate, safety concerns are acute and digital access is uneven. These assumptions often fail. A cross cultural feminist lens recenters those at the margins and foregrounds diverse social realities. Together, these frameworks do something powerful. They shift the question from how do we make AI more efficient to how do we design AI systems that redistribute power, recognize lived experiences, and address social inequality. Now, this combined lens allow us to reimagine digital labor platforms not simply as technological systems, but as political and social infrastructure that must be accountable to those who work within them. Yeah, just moving on to the next slide. In the next section, I move from theory to application. Here, I apply Badzal's feminist design questions to a specific context, ride-hailing platforms. And later in the assignment, also, you'll realize that if once I explain about ride-hailing platforms, you can use the same principles to apply for social media platforms. Rather than speaking abstractly about ethics, I focus on concrete design features that structure everyday work. Specifically, I examine incentives and gamification, rating systems, ride allocation mechanisms, surveillance, data tracking, data governance. These are not just technical features, they are sites where power is exercised, where values are embedded, and where inequalities can either be reproduced or challenged. By analyzing these elements through a feminist HCI lens, we can begin to see how design decisions shaped lived experiences, especially for women and even other marginalized workers. One second. So I have structured my analysis into 6 categories. The first is the acceptance rate, incentives, and gamification, which I interpret through Badzal's idea of the quality of participation. On the left hand side, you will often see that I've put an interview quote of the people I'd interviewed during my PhD. So here I'm talking about acceptance rate. Now, acceptance rate is calculated as the number of rides accepted divided by total ride request. Although platforms claim declining rides does not affect drivers, but most drivers believe cancellations lower their rating or even visibility. Now, if you would keep canceling rides, so that means automatically the platform is going to downgrade you. So that is the primary reason that workers feel that if they cancel the rides, then of course their acceptance rate will decline. However, popular ride hailing platforms have went on record and said that this is not true, but this is what the what platform workers have experienced. Now, as one of the driver would put it, basically she told me that you cannot decline any passenger. Second, while platforms advertise flexibility, incentives are tied to completing a fixed number of rides within a time window. For example, completing 20 rides in 24 hours yield a small bonus. Now this pushes basically drivers to stay longer. Now, this entire thing where after you have finished one ride, the next ride just automatically loads. This creates a gamification model. So that means, drivers are nudged to keep driving because they're close to hitting a target. Participation becomes shaped by algorithmic pressure rather than genuine flexibility. So it's that games, how it happens in games, that you finish something, you get a target, you get a booster, and then you're like, okay, let me just play for 10 more minutes and maybe I'll get this bonus. So this is the entire gamification model which is working in the platform economy itself. Now, importantly, this model is not gender neutral. Women drivers who cannot remain on the road for extended hours due to care responsibilities and safety concerns are structurally disadvantaged. I remember asking drivers about bathroom breaks. Anyway, I'll speak about bathroom breaks in the next slides. So, following Bansal, this calls for dialogue between designers and users. Incentive systems should be recalibrated to support income stability and safe driving rather than compulsive productivity. In short, flexibility in the platform economy is in theory and it becomes conditional participation in practice. Moving on, quality of embodiment. Here, I'm talking about rating dynamics. Drivers are evaluated based on passenger ratings, and these ratings directly affect their visibility and future ride allocation. Drivers explained that if they receive a 1-star rating, they immediately get a notification or a call from their customer care. While the platform may acknowledge their side of the story, overall rating still drops and they begin receiving fewer rides. Another important issue is opacity here. Drivers only see consolidated ratings on their apps. So, due to safety reasons, of course, we're not blaming the platforms also. They do not want, any passengers rated to be, displayed. But if you think from the driver perspective, they cannot even understand detailed feedback or understand the specific reason behind low ratings or scores. Now imagine you have taken 20 rides in a day and you have no idea that which passenger actually downgraded you, or what was the feedback, what was the issue, how can you even work on the issue. They just see as a consolidated rating that the ratings have dropped. Now, in the screenshot shown here, the app also uses the label hero for drivers. While subtle, this imagery assumes a a male driver as a default. I suggest that something as simple as using a Shiro S in brackets hero could symbolically recognize women drivers and challenge gender assumptions embedded in the interface itself. Through Bansal's quality of embodiment, we are reminded that technologies must acknowledge the humanness of the users. When ratings determine livelihood, we must ask on what basis are customers evaluating drivers. While platforms have introduced some qualitative tags, passengers could be encouraged to provide short written feedback. And I think most of you will think that, why would customers give feedback? They're already in rush, but this could be made mandatory before they take on the other ride. Using natural language processing, as I've spoken to some software engineers and AI designers, platforms could analyze whether ratings reflect discriminatory patterns based on gender, appearance, religion, or other attributes. There is also a possibility that a customer is just going through a bad mood. There's also this possibility, some people also told me that it's important that you analyze that what is the rating mechanism of the customer. Do they usually rate 5 stars to everybody? Do they usually don't rate? Do they usually rate 3 stars, 4 stars, 1 star? So this one-sided analysis will not help. It's important that analysis is done quantitatively, qualitatively, but at the same time from the customer's perspective also. So if rating structure basically economic opportunity for the drivers, then embodiment requires ensuring that those systems do not reproduce social biases. Moving on. The next category concerns ride allocation. Now, drivers expressed growing concern about how rides are distributed, who gets short rides, who gets more profitable routes, and on what basis these decisions are actually made. A product manager acknowledged that multiple parameters are used in assigning rides, but he also stated that the weightage of these parameters keeps changing and therefore cannot be revealed. Now, this creates opacity. Through Bansal's quality of self disclosure, users should be aware of how they are being computed by the system. If algorithms are determining their access to work, then workers should have some visibility into the variables affecting those decisions. For examples, platforms could display the key variables influencing ride allocation and their relative weightage. If a driver is deprioritized due to past behavior, that information should be transparent rather than hidden. Now, transparency becomes even more important for women drivers. Many expressed fear of unfamiliar or potentially unsafe locations. One driver noted that the drop location is only revealed in advance after completing 5 rides. Similarly, passengers' names and photographs are also revealed only after accepting the ride. So, this makes it difficult for a woman driver to even understand that whether or not she wants to accept a male driver, a male passenger. This makes transparency one sided. The platform knows everything about the driver, while the driver has limited information about the ride or the passenger. From a feminist design perspective, self disclosure should not be asymmetrical. Algorithmic systems that actually are allocating livelihood must be explainable to those whose income depends on them. Here, I think I would also like to throw some light on 2020 Code on Social Security, which has came into enforcement on 21st November 2025, and now states are kind of coming up with their own policy frameworks about how to implement this Code on Social Security. Now, India's Code on Social Security, you might argue, is giving them, some bit of welfare schemes. They are telling them to give them social security systems. However, things like, again, algorithmic transparency, collective bargaining, ensuring minimum wages, or recognizing them as employees, these are still not part of the Code on Social Security. However, the EU or the European Platform Directive is now moving towards that direction. Of course, we are yet to see how it is going to be fully implemented in the year 2026. But yes, the rest of the world, kind of global north, is moving towards this direction. However, in India, this becomes a distant reality, considering that we are still in the process of right now just enforcing code on social security, and the states are coming up with their own directives. Moving on, I want to talk about constant tracking, surveillance, and algorithmic control. And surveillance actually is one of my favorite topics because surveillance is not only restricted to blue collar workers; it is also in white collar jobs. So I think you will also be able to relate to this. So, talking again back about the ride hailing platforms, drivers are continuously monitored, they are continuously being monitored. As the quote on the left you would see suggests, Their location is tracked every few seconds. Their deviations are immediately detected. While you might say this is justified, they have signed up for this job, and it is justified in terms of safety, fraud prevention, but constant surveillance has broader consequences. Research shows that excessive monitoring can reduce productivity and amplify frustration. When workers feel constantly watched, they often develop clever ways to resist or game the system. It's like you're controlling somebody so much that they become rebellious. So that's what I've extensively read that workers have been doing. And rightfully, you would have also read that in newspapers. Moreover, failure to follow app instructions can result in penalties or even deactivation. Now, this technologically mediated control can negatively affect drivers' mental well being. Through Bansal's quality of ecology, we are encouraged to examine how design artifacts operate within wider social context. Surveillance and tracking are not neutral tools, they shape our behavior, and over time, they shape our subjectivity. If platform design systems that treat drivers as data points, drivers may begin to feel dehumanized. I've also read stories where some of the sanitation workers in India, they are forced to wear bands so that the companies they are working for can track whether they're working. Now these bands also come with cameras installed. Now imagine, I read that some of the women workers are afraid to use washrooms even after going to their respective houses because they think that the camera can see them. So this is the kind of surveillance we are talking. We are talking about the surveillance which is also moving into white collar jobs because Tesla, I think in 2020 when pandemic was there, so that is when Tesla. Sorry, this is the slide I'm talking about. That is when Tesla started tracking keystrokes. So your keyboard keystroke. So that means if you're on your keyboard, if you're working, you're not working. So they started doing that also. Increasingly, companies are also suggesting drivers to install dash cams. Now, from safety perspective, it is necessary because they can also argue in the court of law that we did not do anything. But imagine from a surveillance perspective that you have to drive maybe 20 hours a day or maybe even 16 to 18 hours a day and constantly somebody's watching you. So these are the real questions we are talking about. So one possible direction is to reintroduce human contact into management systems. Women drivers working in hybrid taxi models spoke positively about having accessible managers who provided support. This suggests that trust and relational accountability can mitigate the harshness of purely algorithmic control. In short, the question is not whether monitoring exists, because it is existing, it is platform economy, but how it is ecologically impact, but how its ecological impact on workers' dignity and well-being is being addressed. Moving on, this slide highlights the asymmetry in how data is collected and controlled. Again, data, back to why data is important. According to Uber's privacy documentation, the platform collects drivers' location data when the app is running in the foreground or even in the background. While drivers technically have the option to disable location services, and I tried doing it myself, this must be manually switched on again every time they go on duty. And in fact, you would also realize that every time you launch Instagram, and if you turn off your location, you turn off your camera, then every time you have to click a photograph, of course you have to turn it on back, right? So you have to turn on your location back too. So in practice, how many of us actually do that? We don't keep turning off our location, we don't keep turning off our camera. So, in practice, this means platforms can access drivers' location and related data almost continuously. So, if you're off duty, then also companies are tracking us. However, when something problematic occurs, drivers have reported that this data may be erased or withheld. Now, as you would see if you would see or read the quote on the left hand side, you would realize uh, that this creates a one-sided system of data power. The platform retains control over collection, storage, and deletion. I'm just reading out the quote on the left-hand side, which says, when you go there, I'm just reading the red one, when you go there to complain, then they erase their data. This man was not even driving with us, they erased the data. This is what platform workers have been told. So, this asymmetry reflects a deeper imbalance. Platforms extract extensive data from workers, yet workers have limited access to control over their own data. Through Bansal's quality of advocacy, the question becomes, how can technology promote political and economic empowerment rather than reinforce existing power hierarchies? Drivers should have full and continuous access to their own data. Further, if platforms generate economic value from their data collection, workers should get a share in those benefits. In short, data governance in platform economies must move from extraction towards accountability and also redistribution. Now, this final category focuses on bathroom breaks and safety, which I interpret through Bansal's quality of pluralism. When asked whether algorithms could adjust routes to accommodate restroom breaks, a platform executive responded that drivers have always the option to decline a ride. They can just, switch off the app. They should just decline. They want to use something. However, as you would have realized in my first quality when I spoke about the acceptance rate, you would have realized that declining rides affects their earnings and acceptance rates. Now, in practice, this is not a neutral option. A woman driver pointed out that while men may not face this issue in the same way, women lose business if they stop to look out for a safe and clean washroom. Now, what appears gender neutral at the design level produces unequal consequences in practice. Drivers also raised concerns about safety and lack of meaningful support. When incidents were reported, they often received automated or robotic responses with little visible action. For women drivers in particular, this eroded trust and discouraged continued participation. And I think that's an argument which a lot of women drivers made, that even if we report, I think a lot of passengers also make, that even if we report something, we do not see a resolution from the platform side. So they might just call them the next day. But even if they would have, and they'll say, we'll take an action. Now, even if they will take an action, that resolution does not reach the customer. So the customer or even the driver is actually demotivated to even complain. Bansal's quality of pluralism, as part of the feminist design, ask designers to nurture the marginal rather than assume a universal user. Now, this is important from every perspective. An inclusive platform would account for gendered realities by formally recognizing restroom and lunch breaks, strengthening rapid response systems, and clearly communicating what action has been taken after a complaint. So, pluralism here means designing not for an abstract driver, but for the most vulnerable driver in the system, as we say, lowest common denominator. We would realize that technology is increasingly designed for an average white user who is sitting in the US. Now, because of these reasons, you would also realize that, the car seats are also not designed for women. Even I spoke to Azad Foundation and they told me that they are increasingly trying that women drivers should start driving bus also, commercially. But again, the problem is that the bus seats are also not designed for women. They're shorter in heights, and that is why they're not able to drive them properly. So these are the challenges we are talking about. The technology is not designed for the marginal user. I've also read articles in context to, for instance, iPhone. The iPhones also come, they're bigger in size, so we're not able to hold it from one hand, especially women. And since the technology is designed in the US, so obviously it ignores that people in global South or Asia could be short in height, could have shorter bodies, or should have, they'll not be able to use that technology. So when we are talking about quality of pluralism, we are talking about that how technology should account for all these users, should account for all these contexts, for social realities, for lived realities of people. So these are my central arguments. Now, I think this slide will be of use to you when you do your assignment also. So if you want to take a screenshot, I think you can take it. So this is a 6Q model of feminist and ethical AI design, which I have also proposed in my book chapter with Amsterdam University Press, in the book titled Feminist Futures of Work. So this design can be applied in various other social media contexts, and this slide synthesizes the discussion. At the center is AI governance, because platforms govern work; they do not just facilitate it. Around it are six interlinked qualities, which I just spoke about, which are participation, embodiment, self-disclosure, ecology, advocacy, and pluralism. Together, they shift the focus from efficiency and optimization towards dignity, transparency, accountability, and justice. The key point is that ethical AI in digital labor cannot be reduced to bias correction alone. It must address incentive structures, surveillance practices, data ownership, and the lived realities of marginalized users or the workers here. So these six qualities operate together as a structural framework for rethinking platform governance. I'm just going to read out the diagram also. So the quality of participation talks about work without coercive incentives. Quality of embodiment talks about evaluation without discrimination. Quality of self disclosure talks about explainable algorithmic decisions. Quality of ecology talks about surveillance with human dignity. Quality of advocacy is advocating for data rights, shared value. If you're using data, share the value of it. Quality of pluralism talks about designing for the marginal, not for the average. And these qualities, I would say, can be interpreted in multiple contexts and can be used for different platforms. So, to conclude, I want to re emphasize one central argument, which is digital labor platforms are not neutral marketplaces, they are systems of algorithmic governance. AI does not simply assist work, it allocates tasks, evaluates performance. They are structuring our income, they are determining our visibility, and in doing so, it shapes that precarity. It decides who should get the opportunity, who is excluded, who is included. Now, when efficiency becomes the primary design value without accountability, existing inequalities are reproduced and they are sometimes even amplified. Therefore, ethical AI cannot be reduced to fixing biases in the data sets. It must engage with structural justice, with questions of power, participation, and redistribution. And that is why at Inclusive AI Lab also, we keep on talking about, we keep on organizing participatory workshops where the marginal user should come and participate in the design. So, design should not come from top to bottom, but it should have a synthesis of from bottom to up also. I've spoken to so many people, and even the designers, even the AI, software engineers, they are of the opinion that we do not get to interact with the end user. So somebody, the AI manager or some other manager, tells us what to do. So, in this scenario, even they do not realize that these are the problems which exist. So, if AI is governing the workers, then workers must have must have a role in shaping AI. That I believe is the core political and ethical challenge before us. That how do we include workers? How do we design technology which is not discriminating at this level? And one of the arguments, which I frequently come across is called the covertization. So we cannot deny that technology is there, that ChatGPT is there, humans are here, robots are here, but we have to coexist with this technology. So we have to come up with collaborative measures, and that is why in my next paper also, which I've not spoken about yet, I argue that human intervention is really necessary when we are talking about algorithmic managers. There has to be some sort of human value. A human should be able to resolve the issues when we cannot fully be dependent on machines. So thank you so much. I hope the conversation on feminist design and ethical AI must remain ongoing.